Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to tentatively titled Eye on Ypsi. And it's my pleasure, Alex Thomas, to be here with you. And for my inaugural guest on Eye on Ypsi, I am incredibly proud to have Pam Kisch, Executive Director of the Fair Housing Center for Southeastern Michigan. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, I asked Pam here today because housing is such a pressing issue here in Washtenaw County, Ypsilanti, but specifically within the housing discussion, I wanted to focus on discrimination, and I am so fortunate to have Pam Kisch, the Executive Director, here to talk about that and tell us about the Fair Housing Center and exactly what they do. But before I hear that, I'd like to ask Pam just to tell us a little bit about herself. Are you from Michigan, Pam?
I am. I grew up in East Lansing. I came to Ann Arbor to go to college when I was about 18 years old, and I never left.
Okay.
I
grew up in East Lansing. You became a Wolverine?
I did.
Awesome. Okay.
Please let me get into Michigan. I have a degree in social work, community organizations, and when I was in social work school, I had the opportunity to meet the people, to work on a fair housing project as an internship. And then I met the folks at the Fair Housing Center in Metropolitan Detroit. Cliff Schrupp was the director, and he really mentored me and helped us in the community, along with the NAACP of Ypsilanti Willow Run and the NAACP of Ann Arbor and some other organizations, to start a fair housing center in Washtenaw County. And we were able to open the organization in about 1992.
Oh, wow, that's great to hear. I grew up in this area, and parents were UAW workers, and so I'm really connected to the Willow Run plant. And just hearing about some advocacy around that in the NAACP, another day. I hope to have you hear about that.
Absolutely.
So, did you work primarily in fair housing up until becoming the executive director of the Fair Housing Center?
I was an advocate for homeless teens. I worked at Ozone House for a number of years as a volunteer and then on staff. When I was a student at Michigan, I worked on sexual assault issues, did a lot of sexual assault education, and I worked with a group called UCAR, United Coalition Against Racism, when I was in grad school. So I've kind of always been interested in advocacy issues, and this is just kind of an extension of that.
Okay, well, so when did you start as the executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Southeastern Michigan?
Well, I helped start the organization, so when I asked if I could be the executive director, I guess they had to say yes.
Okay. And was that 92 that you said?
Yeah, I actually, before we opened the office, I finished my MSW, and I got a job at the Fair Housing Center in Metropolitan Detroit as the assistant coordinator of investigations. Okay. So that was the Fair Housing Center in Metropolitan Detroit did more litigation than any other fair housing center in the country. They took 250 or more complaints a year, so it was an incredible training ground. And as it happens, the director, Cliff Schrupp, was a national expert in starting fair housing centers. Okay. So it was the perfect place to be for those of us who we wanted to start an organization, and I was kind of learning the basics from, really the national experts at the Fair Housing Center in Detroit.
Okay, I'd imagine if someone wanted to go to the website, they might be able to find some of that history, or maybe Google Cliff Schrupp or something.
Cliff Schrupp. Unfortunately, Cliff has been gone for a few years, but yes, absolutely. The Fair Housing Center Metropolitan Detroit is, we still work closely with them, as with the other fair housing centers in Michigan. We meet at least twice a year, and we're on the phone with each other all the time.
Well, thanks for that information. We have such a void in media just from day to day, and sometimes I think we might forget about just a time when so much more of that history was available and accessible. So starving to get current news.
Right.
But it's such a rich.
Right.
That's to know that tradition of advocacy is there, and just the resources in Detroit is good. But I want to get to the Fair Housing Center here in your work now. What does the Fair Housing Center do exactly?
All right, well, we're a local nonprofit. We're not a government agency. And we take complaints from people, families who face discrimination in housing. So people who are denied housing, mostly rental housing, but also sale of housing or mortgage. And there are all kinds of ways that people face discrimination. Sometimes people live in a place, but they're not getting the same services that other people are getting. They'll call us and say, my refrigerator doesn't work, and I've been asking for months to get a new refrigerator, and I just saw the person down the hall get a new refrigerator, but they won't replace my refrigerator. And so we start to ask them, how long have you lived there? What's your race? What's your national origin? And we find out they're African American or Latino. And the person who got the new refrigerator, can you tell me something about them? What's their race, their national origin? Oh, they're white. We start to think, well, maybe this has a racial component, or this is discrimination based on national origin.
Okay, and excuse me for a moment,
yes.
But you did say Latino, and we're here in Contacto, Michigan, CMY. Please download the app. We really have a large Spanish-speaking audience, and you mentioned Latino, but specifically undocumented, of any nationality. How are there any concerns that they should have when in contacting the Fair Housing Center? And if you could explain just what that would entail for them, because in the current political times, we just want to know that population to know what's available to them and exactly what risk, if any, that they are taking.
Again, we're a private nonprofit organization. We're not a government agency. All complaints made to our organization are confidential. The person who calls us, we say, you're in the driver's seat. If we investigate your claim and there's evidence, you decide whether you want to go forward or not. If you have questions, or family has questions or concerns about their status, we have attorneys and other fair housing experts around the country that we can contact and get the best advice that we can about how to proceed.
And is it illegal for a landlord to discriminate on basis of citizenship or being undocumented?
Well, one of the things we always ask is, is the landlord asking every single person who walks through the door, what is your citizenship status? Okay. What is your immigration status? Are Canadians treated the same way as someone coming from Mexico?
That's right.
So,
or Haitians, for that matter.
Exactly. We want to know, are people being treated equally? And one of the unusual things about a fair housing center, one of the services that we provide that really makes us unique is undercover housing testing. So if someone calls us and says, I think I'm being discriminated against because I'm originally from Honduras, we'd say, okay, we're gonna, the landlord won't rent to me. I put in an application, they never got back to me. They told me that they lost my application. These are the kinds of excuses you might hear. We would send in two testers, a white American tester and a Latino tester. If we could find someone from Honduras, we'll send someone from Honduras. If not, we'll do the best we can. And both will go and say, yes, I'm married, I have 2 children, I want to move in on November 1st. And both of those testers will report back to us. And they should be treated exactly the same way. They should be told how many apartments are available, what's the price of the apartment. They should be shown similar apartments, not one shown a lovely apartment on the 3rd floor with a view of a lake, and the other one is shown a crappy apartment in the basement that's dripping water in the corner. We want to know, are people being shown the same kinds of units, the same kinds of amenities, the same rent, the same security deposit. And if we see a pattern of a property owner or agent treating people differently based on their race, their national origin, whether they have kids, whether they have a disability, then we meet with people and talk about what kind of action they can take.
I've heard of different examples on the basis of ethnic sounding names. Has the Fair Housing Center been involved in any type of testing of that? Or a Spanish speaking name or a so-called African American?
You can do that kind of testing. You can do it through text. We have not done much of that testing. Okay. We do most of our testing, in person or over the phone. If it's not for national origin or race, we can do the testing over the phone. Okay.
Well, I just want to reiterate that any complaints to the Fair Housing Center are completely anonymous, and you said that complainant is in the driver's seat as far as how they would like to proceed. So you definitely are encouraged if you do feel that you have been discriminated against on the basis of citizenship, the other categories we're going to mention. Please please contact the Fair Housing Center, and we'll have the contact information available. So don't worry, Pam.
Okay.
I'll make sure it's associated.
Yeah, I'm going to the Federal Fair Housing Act, I just want to list what's covered under the Fair Housing Act.
Great time.
Since we're talking about it. It bans discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex, including sexual harassment, disability, and that's physical disability or a mental emotional disability, and familial status, which just is a fancy word for if you have children under 18 living in your house. And then Michigan law adds to that age. You can't be discriminated against if you're too young or too old, or your marital status, if you're married or unmarried. Of course, there are exemptions for senior housing, but those have to be those are very specific housing designated for seniors, and they've been approved to be housing for seniors. You can't just wake up one morning and say, gee, I think I'd like to be senior housing. You have to go through a process and be approved to be senior housing.
Okay, thanks. What immediately came to mind, when we had spoken earlier, you mentioned some other types of discrimination that I hadn't considered. Oh, I know. I lost my train of thought for a moment. But you had mentioned that you couldn't be discriminated against because you have a boy or a girl, and they'd be in the same room.
That's
or
right.
Something. I mean, because I think that's from the layperson, just urban myth.
Exactly.
I guess
exactly.
If you could tell us specifically cover that, because
well, what I like to say is, if the landlord's not tucking you in at night, he or she has nothing to say about who's sleeping in what room. Okay. If you're the parent, you decide. It's perfectly legal. If a bedroom's big enough for two people, a parent and a child can share that bedroom, regardless of the age of that. Yes, some people don't want their kids in their room, but if you have two kids and you want them to share a bedroom, it's better to have a two-bedroom and have your kids share a room than to be homeless.
Yeah.
Or if you need a three-bedroom and you can't afford a four-bedroom. I mean, it's very hard to find housing in Washtenaw County, and whatever works for your family, again, as long as it's within health and safety code, the fire department and the building department say, you can't over occupy a unit. You can't have 10 people in a two-bedroom apartment because that's not safe or healthy.
Absolutely.
But if it's within the health and safety codes, it's nobody's business who's sharing a bedroom.
Cool. This is kind of a broad question because that was so surprising because I was misinformed. Are there some other really popular misconceptions about discrimination or excuses that landlords might give that might be hiding some forms of discrimination?
I mean, we certainly have seen landlords say, oh, well, it's state law, a boy and a girl can't share a bedroom. Well, it's not state law. It might be state law if your family is involved with protective services or you're a foster parent, but that has nothing to do with a landlord.
Okay.
They're not the state. I think there's some misconceptions about sexual harassment against women by a landlord. That's considered a fair housing violation. It's considered sex discrimination. And unfortunately, we've seen too many of these terrible cases. And these, we find, are landlords who they very carefully choose their tenants. They choose women who are single with children. They choose women who don't have the best credit. They are often housing of last resort. And they do that because they know that the women living there are extremely vulnerable and not likely to move out. And they know that they're more likely to be able to get away with sexually harassing a woman. And that could mean coming in at all hours of the day and night without being announced, using a key, making comments, asking a woman out. It goes all the way, of course, unfortunately, to sexual assault, to touching people, to coming in when she's in the shower. All of these things are covered under the Fair Housing Act.
I was about to ask, I don't want to create a landlord list of shame, but yes, I do. Is there a public list of people that have a history, just a record where they can go to?
You can look at the fair. I can only talk about cases that have gone to litigation. So you can go to our website, www.fhcmichigan.org, and you can look at our case list, and it will describe every litigation that we've had since 1992.
Okay, great. So we know the Fair Housing Center, what they do, and heard some ways about how they do it. Can you maybe, are you at liberty to talk about any, or just the like some of the cases?
Oh, of course.
That recently
Absolutely.
That might.
Absolutely.
not.
We can only talk about cases that have settled or have been filed, but I can talk about some cases.
I won't tell anybody.
No. These are, I say
Off the air.
when we're investigating a case, I don't even tell the board of directors until the case is filed with an attorney.
Okay.
Okay. So we had a familial status. Again, this is a discrimination against families with kids. Called Pippins versus Tricula. So Cicely Pippins contacted the Fair Housing Center, and she
this
said,
was in?
it's in Monroe County.
Okay.
And she said, I found this perfect 2-bedroom apartment for myself and my 2 kids. It was in my price range. I went to the landlord. She gave me the application, and she asked me if I had kids, and I said, it's just for you. And she said, no, it's for myself and my 2 kids. And she literally pulled the application out of my hands and told me she doesn't rent to families with kids. I was shocked, and I left. And she called us. She was also African American, so we immediately tested it for both race and familial status. We got very strong evidence that the landlord did not rent to families with children in violation of the Fair Housing Act. And then we met with Ms. Pippins, and we said, what would you like to do? Would you like to file a complaint with a state or federal agency? We can help you file a complaint with HUD, with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. We also have a list of attorneys who will take your case to federal court or state court. She said she wanted to file a lawsuit. So we found her an attorney, Steve Tomkowiak. They filed the lawsuit, and it very quickly settled for $20,000. And she used that money to put a down payment on a house.
All right. Great.
So.
Right.
We also have worked on cases we would call a racially motivated eviction. And this would be, I'm a white woman, I move into an apartment complex, everything's fine, I have a party, and the landlord sees that I have friends and relatives who are from other parts of the world, who are African American. The landlord thinks, oh gee, I gotta get rid of this woman. And so he or she just finds some reason to evict me. So that would be a racially motivated eviction. We had another kind of a racially motivated eviction in a case called Scott v. Swan Creek. And this is a situation where the Scott family is a mom with 2 teenage daughters, and one of the teenage daughters was being harassed by a white family that lived in the same mobile home complex.
Okay.
And the harassment had escalated, and the mother of the white teenager, when the African-American teenager got off the school bus, she physically assaulted her. The police came, they charged the white mother with assault, and the next thing we knew, the African-American family was sent an eviction notice. So this is a situation where we waited for the white mother to be convicted of the assault, which she was. And then we looked at the differences in the way the manager treated the 2 families. So there's a police report against the white family for assault, and the African-American daughter is the victim. And so the manager went to the white family and got their side of the story and evicted the African-American family. She never went to the African-American family and said, what's your side of the story? So we were able to show that there was a difference in treatment, serious difference in treatment.
That conviction.
Yes. So after she was
And where was
found,
that at again? I'm sorry.
that was in the Ann Arbor area.
Okay. Washtenaw County.
He was in Washtenaw County,
Right.
definitely,
Okay.
yeah. That case settled for an undisclosed amount.
Okay.
Yeah, the landlord was sued for race discrimination. It's also important to know that if you work for a landlord or company that asks you to discriminate, you're covered by the law. So if you work in if you're a mortgage lender, or you are a rental agent, and your landlord says, and your boss says to you, don't rent to anybody who's not American. Don't rent to African Americans. Don't rent to anyone with teenagers. Don't rent to anyone with children under the age of 5. Whatever the boss says. We had a young woman, she's 24 years old. She called us on her first day of work to tell us that her boss had told her not to rent to families with children in a 1-bedroom apartment. You can't have a parent and a child. sharing a one-bedroom. She said, I've been to fair housing training, and that's illegal. And he said, look, I bought the building from someone else. That's the way they've always done it. That's the way I want you to do it. And she called us, and she coordinated with us. She said, here are the 2 days a week that I'm not in the office. And the owner himself or herself, the couple, they won't answer the phone. So that's when we did the testing. We got very strong evidence of discrimination against families with children. And she, we helped her sue because she didn't want to move into the apartment. Often if you're the agent, you can move in and get free housing. Well, she didn't want to move in because she knew that any moment she was going to say no to the landlord and they were going to fire her. She ended up leaving her job and finding another job, and that also settled for an undisclosed amount.
Okay, that's some extremely useful information. You mentioned in that training, fair housing training. Is that something that's open to everyone, or something that Fair Housing Center offers, or what is that?
We do, twice a year, we do something called Housing Advocates Training, and it's geared towards people who work in human service organizations. So you might work at Safe House with women who are the victims of domestic violence, and you know all about domestic violence, but you don't know anything about housing. But all of your clients have housing problems.
Yes.
Or you might work at the community mental health, and you know a lot about treatment of mental illness, but you might not be an expert in housing issues. So we focus the training on kind of frontline human service workers, because we know that their clients are very vulnerable to housing discrimination, and we want them to just know enough to say, we should call the Fair Housing Center.
Absolutely.
We also do...
and is that here in Ypsilanti?
We do it in Ypsilanti once a year. We do it in Washtenaw County once a year, and then we cover 8 counties, so we kind of move it around. Sometimes we do it in Jackson County or Ingham County or some other counties. And
are we close? Should we pass it up, or?
I don't know.
I'll figure it out and we'll put it up.
Absolutely.
That wasn't fair.
Absolutely.
But thanks for telling us about it.
No, it's a good training. And we've been doing it for about, 20 years, and now we're developing an advanced housing advocates training. So people who've been to housing advocates training, but they kind of want the next level of training. We're working on that now. And clients are also, people can bring the clients they work with, they're also invited to come to housing advocates training.
Just speaking of training, one of the most useful ones that I went to were recipients' rights for mental health.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, as mental health relates to housing discrimination.
That is a great question.
If you could enlighten us a bit.
Absolutely. Mental health, people with mental and emotional disabilities are covered under the Fair Housing Act. It's one of the most common complaints we get in our office: physical disability, then race, then mental emotional disability. So some of the kinds of things we see are we had a young man who, because of his insurance change, his medication was coming in a new form. It was coming in pill form instead of injection form, and it was really throwing him for a loop. He was up all night. It just ruined his sleep. He was acting erratically, and he was causing causing noise problems. So he got an eviction notice. And we talked to him and to his advocate, and we realized what the issue was he had been really stable for 10 or 15 years, lived in the same place, but because of this medication change that was no fault of his, he was having a lot of symptoms. So we were able to say to the landlord, look, we're asking for a reasonable accommodation. He needs a couple of weeks to get his medication back on track. His advocate's working with him to get his old insurance back, or to get the injections that he needs. That will stop his symptoms, and we're asking for a second chance for him. And they granted him a second chance, and the symptoms were under control, and he was able to continue to live there. So we see a lot of things like that.
Okay.
Or let's say someone has a mental emotional disability, and they forget to pay their rent for some reason. We can work out. Someone will say, "Well, your rent is late every month," and we'll say, "Well, you know what? This is sort of a side effect of their mental emotional disability, or it's a part of it. Why don't we set something up so it's direct deposit, and then the landlord, you'll get your rent exactly on time. Just give the person a second chance so we can set this up," and that's been really successful. For people with mental emotional disabilities and people with physical disabilities who receive SSI or SSDI and can't work, people don't get their Social Security check on the first of the month when the rent is due. Some people get it on the third of the month. But some people, based on their birthday, get it on the third Wednesday of the month or the second Wednesday of the month. And we have certainly had situations where people with physical disabilities and mental emotional disabilities are getting evicted every month. They're being sent eviction paperwork every month, and they're getting these. They're getting fined, $50 a month or $100 a month for these late fees. So we've been able to, it's called asking for a reasonable accommodation. You have to treat people the same, but when someone has a disability, you have to bend the rules. So we've been asking for, let this person pay their rent after the third Wednesday of the month. Unless the landlord can show it's going to cause them an extreme hardship or it's going to be an undue burden, then they have to say yes.
Boy, there's so much.
There is so much.
We have about, we can go a little over. We have about 5 minutes, but I'm sure you have some. I was going to ask about, I'm going to give you definitely that. You'll be able to close it. I'll give you the last word. What is your choice? I was going to ask you about, and that might have been what's on your mind, but the recent, the proposed changes by the Trump administration in housing, and that recent public comment that was open that I encouraged some people to participate in. I wanted you to touch on that, and also anything else that you had in the next 5-6 minutes.
Okay.
Go for it.
So disparate impact. There was a national campaign to save disparate impact. Under the current administration, they are trying to take disparate impact out of the HUD guidelines.
And could you explain that?
Yes,
Probably
of
about
course.
to.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, who knows what disparate impact is? So let's say a landlord or a bank has a rule, and it applies to everyone. We don't make mortgage loans for under $50,000. Well, let's say if you look at a city, and where are the houses that cost under $50,000? Well, let's guess that they're in an African American or Latino neighborhood. So they might have just an overall policy that seems race neutral, but it has a disparate impact. It hurts the African American community. It hurts the Latino community. So we need that in the law.
And it's a settled law.
This is settled law, the Supreme Court of the United States. Yes. So that's what we're trying to preserve. It's very important that we preserve it. Another aspect of this is not only to do away with disparate impact, but it also says if, let's say, a lending institution can show that their rule, their neutral rule, makes them money. If it's profitable, then you can't get rid of it unless you can show, even if it's discriminatory, it has a disparate impact on people, you can't get rid of it unless you can show that there is an equally profitable way to do it in a non-discriminatory way. So it makes, it shifts the burden.
This change will put the burden on
tenants or tenants organizations or, the citizens.
To give an alternative.
To give an alternative. Well, that's pretty difficult because we don't have the algorithms that they're using. And
we're looking for a place to live.
Right.
Pay bills.
So it really turns the tables and gives gives more advantage to banks and lending institutions.
I know we have a really informed audience. Are there some court cases recently that I could point people to Google that might highlight? Some recent or fair housing cases recent. I know. I don't want to advocate for a candidate, but there's a guy running for prosecutor that I know he was involved in some recent legislation, and just for our wonks out there that want to, Miss Murphy.
Oh, the Mrs. Murphy exemption. Okay.
Okay.
The Mrs. Murphy exemption is. So if a landlord owns 4 or fewer units, or if it's an owner-occupied duplex.
And a lot of confusion around this, by the way, too.
Right. There are some exemptions to the Fair Housing Act, but it's important to know that there is never an exemption to race discrimination, because race discrimination is covered under the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Michigan Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So race is never exempt If you own a single-family house, if you own a duplex, or you own 4 units, you're still not exempt. And you're not allowed to make your discriminatory wishes known. You can't run an ad in the newspaper that says, owner-occupied duplex, no children. That's illegal. Because even if you're allowed to deny somebody, you're not allowed to print or publish that kind of an advertisement.
Okay. And if someone feels they've been discriminated against on any of these on any of these bases,
please call us. Our number is 877-979-3247. We know it's incredibly difficult for people who have felony backgrounds or even sometimes misdemeanors to find housing. HUD has a rule that says you cannot have landlords cannot have blanket no felony policies. So if you have a felony or a misdemeanor or even an arrest, we've had to help somebody who just had an arrest record who was denied housing, please call us and let us know, and we will investigate that, and we may be able to help you. And even if we can't help you, we might be able to help, let's say it hasn't been a long enough time since you've been out or since the felony occurred, we might be able to open up that housing for other people or for you in the future. So please call us. Landlords have to have more nuanced policies. They have to look at how long ago the felony was, what was the crime, and what the person has done to better their lives since the occurrence of the felony.
Well, thank you so much for putting in. I'm always concerned about the returning citizens community.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's just tough in general for everyone. But then when you add those, just our returning citizens, I mean, they need as much opportunity as we can give them. Anything else that you want to cover on fair housing discrimination? We have 90 seconds.
Always err on the side of calling us if you're not sure. And also, emotional support animals are a big issue. We've helped a lot of people. Emotional support animal, it's not a trained service animal or a seeing eye dog. If you have mental or emotional disability and you have been prescribed or suggested by a therapist or a doctor that you have an animal, we can help you make sure that you don't have to pay pet rent, or even if a place has a no pets policy.
Maybe you can dispel urban myths. Maybe you just answered it though. But I thought the laws are pretty liberal on what makes an official support dog or not. That makes you.
I don't want to. An emotional support animal is a non-trained animal, so that could be just a kitten. It could be a frog. It could be it can be anything. Okay. The key is the person has a mental emotional disability that's been documented by a therapist or a family member or a doctor, an MD.
Depression, anxiety.
Yes, but it has to rise to the level of a disability. A lot of people are depressed or they have anxiety, but it doesn't rise to the level of a disability. It has to be disabling. So that's the key there.
Okay. I'm a big advocate for our furry friends. So, if we can get them in there anyway. Right. Okay. It's been anything else before?
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope this has been of help to people in the community.
I certainly think it has. I'll give you some feedback, and it's been an incredible pleasure to have you on the inaugural show. And audience, please tune in to Contacto Michigan, download the CMY app, and we will talk to you next week on Eye on Ypsi. Appreciate you for tuning in. Thank you, Pam Kisch.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.